Are heavy tennis rackets good for the arm? Can you prevent tennis elbow by playing with a heavy racket? I'm going to give you the quick answer right off the bat. No. Generally speaking, heavy tennis rackets are not good for the arm. In fact, playing with a racket that's too heavy might give you tennis elbow. But there are going to be some players, and there's going to be some players in my audience who are going to be okay with playing with heavy rackets. And interestingly, these players might actually get more trouble with their elbow if they play with a light racket. For those type of players, it is absolutely okay to play with a heavy racket. Sounds confusing, right? Well, it's really complex trying to figure out what racket is good for a certain player. And not only is it about what racket specifications suit a player's game style and body, it's also taking the muscle memory of that player into consideration. Players will get used to a certain racket, and also the arm gets used to that certain racket. Now, one mistake that recreational players make is they give recommendations based on their own experiences. So players might be comfortable with a certain racket, and then they give advice to other players thinking that if it's good for them, it must be good for other players as well. And you just can't go by that, because every player is going to have a different muscle memory, every player is going to have a different game style, and also every player is going to have a different body. So let me tell you a quick little story, something that happens all the time with my students. I have a lot of students who are Roger Federer fans, of course. Roger Federer may be the most beloved tennis player of all time, and naturally players want to play with Roger's racket, and not just any of Roger's rackets, the actual Roger Federer autograph, the RF97, which is 340 grams. Now look guys, I get it. This is a beautiful racket. It's got a cool paint job. It looks so sleek, and Roger Federer plays with it, so it's got the cool factor going for it. And understandably so, a lot of recreational players who are Roger fans, but not only Roger fans, will pick up this racket as their racket of choice. Now here's a little story that I'm going to tell you. I had this guy who came to me for a lesson very recently, and he's a strong guy, a tall guy. He was about 6'4", and he was an athlete his whole life. And he chose this racket because of Roger Federer, and then from day one he played with this racket, and he asked me, "Hey Nick, what do you think? Is this a good racket for me? Should I try something else?" And I asked him the following questions. Do you have any pain in your arm? And he said, no, I don't have any problems with the arm. Then I asked him, how do you like playing with this racket? Do you feel like it suits your game style? Does it feel comfortable when you hit the ball? Do you feel like you have control? And also, do you feel like you have power? And he answered all those questions with yes. So I told him, there's really no need for you to try the rackets. If you like this one, you don't have any pain, you seem to be playing well with it, why switch something that is working? Now here's the other side of the story. I have many other students who play with this racket, and most of them are not built like the guy that I was talking about previously. They're just average recreational tennis players, and they chose this racket for similar reasons, because they like Roger Federer, they like the way this racket looks. But unfortunately, a lot of these players that I teach don't necessarily play well with this racket, and to make things worse, they even have problems with their elbow. So I tell these players, look, this racket is simply too heavy for you. It's 340 grams. By the way, this is unstrung. Whatever is stamped on the racket, that's an unstrung weight. That's what I go by. I know a lot of you guys in one of my previous racket recommendation videos, you guys were asking me, I think 50 times at least, whether I'm talking about unstrung versus strung weight. No, when I'm referring to a racket's weight, I'm always referring to it unstrung, whatever is stamped on the racket. I understand the Tennis Warehouse puts the strung weight of a racket on their website. To me, it doesn't make any sense, because if a racket is strung, it's going to weigh more than it is unstrung. But we unfortunately don't know what strings are on the racket, so our natural gut strings the same weight. If they're 16 gauge as some very thin polyester of 18 gauge, of course not. There's going to be differences in the weight of the strings itself. So that's not really an accurate way to describe a racket's weight. The old school way, what I've been going by my whole life, is whatever is stamped on the racket. In this case, this racket is 340 grams. So for the average recreational player, and the level is important when we're talking about recreational players. So in my experience, the better the level of players, the more likely they're going to be able to play with a racket like this. So let's say 4.5 level and above, more likely to be able to pull off a racket like this than players who are below the 4.5 level. But the players that I'm talking about in today's video are more in the range of 3.0 to 4.0. And yes, like I said in the beginning, the player I was talking about in the beginning of the video, the really fit tall guy, he was maybe at the 4.0 rating, and he was absolutely fine to use this racket. However, the vast majority of players that I see in my lessons that choose this racket, it is a racket that's simply too heavy for them. So my recommendation is to look for something lighter around the 300 gram range. And by the way, there are a few lighter versions of the Federer Pro Staff racket, and this is going to be true for any racket. There's going to be different versions of it. And if you're the average recreational player with average athleticism, playing with a heavy racket might not prevent tennis elbow. This is just simple fact. I know there's a lot of theories out there, but what I go by is my experience. I've been doing this for a long time. I've seen many recreational players with tennis elbow, and what you have to go by is simple logic. Would you give this 340 gram racket to a junior player, or would you give this 340 gram racket to a female player? No, you would not. Why? Because it would be too heavy and it could possibly hurt their arm. And the same is true for the vast majority of male recreational players. Let's face it, take a look at your local club and do you see a lot of unbelievably fit guys like Roger Federer walking around? No. And of course you don't, because we're not talking about professional tennis, we're talking about recreational tennis. So for the average recreational player that doesn't have muscle memory built up, there's an important distinction, because if you play with a heavy racket from day one, your body and your arm is going to get used to it and you're going to be just fine. But let's just say one of these average recreational players hears advice where if you play with a super heavy racket, this will prevent tennis elbow, and a player goes and grabs this racket and 2 weeks later they got a sore elbow. It's exactly because of the racket. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out why all of a sudden the player who is playing with a much heavier racket is getting arm pain. Is because what happens when you play with a heavier racket, you're going to get less power. This is just simple fact. And now what the player is going to have to do is swing more. The racket will not go through the air as easily as it did before, and they're going to have to put a little bit more effort, put a little bit more pressure on the arm, and then it's very common that the arm starts to hurt. So guys, this whole thing with rackets and tennis elbow, it gets really complex. And let's not even talk about strings. In my experience, strings are even a greater contributor to tennis elbow than rackets are. And not only that, but also the way rackets are strung. It is a big problem these days with the new modern strings. The strings don't break. Players leave them on the rackets way too long. Also, the rackets get strung too tight. The pull speed on the stringers is too high, and the strings get overstretched. And it's a really complex issue. So it's not all about rackets. Even if you have tennis elbow, and going to a lighter racket might not be the only answer. I made a separate video on tennis elbow that you can check out, where I discuss some of the other reasons why you might be feeling pain in your arm. And to all you Wilson Pro Staff fans, I have great news. I have an awesome video coming up very soon on the top 5 greatest rackets of all time. I'm going to give you a spoiler. I'm not going to tell you what number in the rankings this racket received, but it was definitely in the top 5 greatest rackets of all time. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to go on a computer and order one of these rackets right away. Remember what I said in this video. I'm going to say it again, but really listen to me. If the racket that you're playing with is not giving you any pain in your arm, if you like the way this racket feels when you play, if you're having good control, good power, and good feel, and also if you like the optics of a racket. I need a racket to look good. I'm not going to play with an ugly racket. So as far as looks, this is one of the best looking rackets of all time, I can tell you that. So if all those boxes are checked, there's absolutely no reason why you should even think about switching rackets. Just keep playing with the racket that you have. The only issue that you're going to run into, if it's an older model and it's discontinued, now you got to go on eBay. But the great thing about eBay is that you can find old rackets. I'm currently hunting down Babolat Pure Drive Plus, the 2017 model. I'm stocking up on them because I'm the type of player, if something works for me, I'm going to be playing with it forever.